Hello! In this module, we're going to continue our discussion of God's existence or non-existence. We're going to be looking at David Hume and the problem of evil and his argument that God does not exist. So let's quickly review where we've been. We saw that Paley has this design argument for the existence of God, the idea being that there are elements of the universe, particular life, that are well ordered. The only two ways those could arise are either through a huge coincidence or being created by a powerful intelligence. And given that huge coincidences are unlikely, it follows that, or very unlikely, it follows that almost certainly there is a supreme intelligence. We saw that this premise, the second premise of Paley's argument, is false. It's not true that a well-ordered thing is either a huge coincidence or created by powerful intelligence, and that's because of the process of evolution. The well-ordered thing might have evolved over a long time, a series of gradual steps, each of which increases complexity a minute amount, but which pile up and lead to very, very complex entities like beings like us. So Paley's argument as it stands does not succeed. It's an unsound argument and therefore does not establish the conclusion. Now, one thing you might wonder is, well, maybe the conclusion is true. Is it false? The fact that the argument fails leaves that open. All we know is that this argument as it stands does not establish the conclusion. Maybe it could be improved. Maybe we could find other aspects of the universe that can't be explained by a process of evolution, and there are people who try to argue that, sometimes give arguments called fine-tuning arguments. But we're going to, because we don't have time to discuss all the arguments, and this is not a philosophy of religion class, we're going to turn to a different argument. We're going to turn to the problem of evil and Hume's attempt to show that the problem of evil demonstrates that God does not exist. So who's David Hume? Well, he lived from 1711 to 1776. That makes him a contemporary of Paley's, lived at the same time. He was Scottish, so he lived on the Isle of Britain in what was the United Kingdom, then the Kingdom of Scotland. And so very, very influential philosopher. As we'll see later, he had some very deep personal flaws, which we'll talk about in a later module. Publicly, Hume was agnostic, which is to say he didn't say whether or not he thought God existed. Privately, it's very likely that he was atheist. The argument we're going to look at is, which he wrote, looks like it has an atheist conclusion, but in Hume's time, it was illegal to be atheist or to say that you were atheist it was so in Scotland. And so he couldn't, if he wanted to maintain his good reputation and not get in legal trouble, he couldn't say he was atheist. And so it's very likely that that's why he didn't come out explicitly with an atheist sort of conclusion. We need a little bit of context for the reading from the dialogues concerning natural religion, and so that's where we're going to start. We want to know that for Hume, what does God mean? It means something like the intelligent creator of the universe. And maybe there is such a thing, maybe it's perfect, or maybe it's not. So when Hume uses the word God, he's not assuming that it's a perfect being. Hume gives us this basic analogy for his argument against the existence of a perfect being, which is, suppose you found a poorly designed house, like this house, which has a wall going through the middle of that stairway, and so part of that is a stairway not to heaven, but a stairway to nowhere. On confronting this, if you were in this house and you saw this, you'd think, oh, probably the architect is mediocre or bad, hardly a perfect architect. Maybe if you knew a lot of sort of other buildings that the architect had designed, you would come to a different conclusion. But if this was all the evidence you had, you would think, bad architect. And Hume says that's a situation we're in with the world. When we look out into the universe, what we see really is something like this, and so we should conclude that the creator of the universe, whatever it is not such a great architect. So he says the world is not so great in many ways. There are ways in which it's good, but actually ways in which it's not so great. In fact, it's so bad that, first of all, it doesn't provide evidence for the existence of a perfect being. And so Hume thinks that the life is well-ordered premise is actually not true of Paley's argument. So he disagrees with Paley's argument. But more importantly, he thinks, in fact, what's most likely, given how poorly the universe is, how poorly off the universe is, there isn't a perfect being, and whatever created the universe is morally neutral. It doesn't care about good or bad, or in particular, it doesn't care about being good. Nor does it care about being bad. It doesn't really seem to care at all. Maybe it doesn't have the capacity to care. Maybe it's not a mind or a being like that at all. So what is this problem of evil? Well, the conclusion is that God does not exist. So premise one is that there is evil, and the second premise is if God exists, then there is no evil. So what do we think about this argument then? Well, the question we want to ask is it sound? And we know that if an argument is valid, so no matter what the conclusion is true if the premises are, and there's no premises have been left out, so it's valid, and the premises are true, then it's a sound argument and the conclusion is true. On the other hand, if there's a missing premise, or if the conclusion can be false while the premises are true, so the premises don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, then the argument is invalid and therefore unsound and does not provide a reason to believe the conclusion. And again, if it has a false premise, then it's unsound and does not provide a reason to believe the conclusion. So when we look at this argument, we can ask, is it valid and are the premises true? And it is valid no matter what the conclusion is true if the premises are, and we don't need any more knowledge to tell that, but we want to ask, are the premises true? Well, we might think it's pretty plausible that there's evil. The world certainly doesn't look perfect. There's some people, because there are people who will say pretty much anything in philosophy, who think, no, there isn't any evil. But most, we're not going to worry about that. But what about this premise, if God exists, there is no evil? Why would that be? You might wonder. Right? Why is that? It's not actually obvious at all. So this premise is problematic. So we have this idea of a perfect being which is all-powerful and all-knowing and purely good. So maybe we can improve this argument by explicitly talking about a perfect being. So the second premise will then be not about God, but a perfect being would prevent all evil, and we could conclude a perfect being does not exist. This again is valid, so that's good, but we want to ask also, are the premises true, right? Well, again, there's evil, that's our old premise, but what about this one about a perfect being? Would a perfect being prevent all evil? Well, that's also problematic. You might think, yes, a perfect being would prevent all evil because they're perfectly good, so they want to stop all evil, and they know everything, so they know how to stop all evil, and they're powerful, so they can make anything happen, and so put those together, and they will in fact do whatever it is that would prevent all evil. But it's not obvious that that's a good argument. Maybe, for example, this perfect being, a perfect being who we imagine creates the universe, would give her creatures free will. You might think free will is really great, but evil is the cost of free will. And free will is so good that the evil that some beings who have it do with when they act freely, they act evilly and cause evil, that evil that they do, that is worth the cost of free will, that free will is the benefits of free will outweigh the costs of the evil that is done when free will is in the world. And so maybe the perfect being would in fact allow at least some evil because it's the cost of free will and it's worth it. So there's often a distinction that people draw between, on the one hand, moral evil, which are evil choices and their evil consequences, and natural evil, which is all the other evil, so that would include things like diseases and earthquakes. And so Hume discusses both of these, and he thinks that there's both moral evil that a perfect being would not allow, and natural evil that a perfect being would not allow. And we're going to focus on the natural evil part. So let's see how the argument looks when we put in natural evil. So what Hume is going to say is there is natural evil, things like diseases and earthquakes and tsunamis and so on. And the question is, and then he says we might then add the next premise, a perfect being would prevent all natural evil, because that natural evil is by definition not a consequence of free will, right? That's what free will, and it's the evil that's a consequence of free will, that's the moral evil. So now we're talking about all the evil that's not a consequence of free will. So again, this is a good, valid argument. Is it sound? Well, are the premises true? Certainly seems like there's natural evil, but what about this one? Would a perfect being prevent all natural evil? Well, again, it's not obvious. This is not an obvious premise. why is this premise possibly problematic? Well, it might be that there's what Hume calls unavoidable natural evil. This phrase is a little bit confusing, I think, so we're instead going to use this phrase, for the best natural evil that's for the best. So lots of theists believe that free will produces moral evil because people are free and so they can do evil things, but that moral evil is for the best. Why? Well, because there's free will, and free will is really good, and that moral evil is an unfortunate consequence of the free will, but the free will is worth it, and there's no better option. And so some people think that some moral evil is for the best, and you might also think that some natural evil is for the best. And so we're going to need to consider, this is really going to be the central question for the rest of this discussion. Is all natural evil for the best, or is there some natural evil that is not for the best? To figure out the answer to that question, we first have to get clear about what we mean by for the best, because there are actually some confusions here, and we need to clarify that. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about what do we mean by for the best, and then we'll try to answer this question. Is all natural evil for the best? Or rather, is there some natural evil that is not for the best? So that's what we'll be up to in the subsequent videos.